going to continue our journey through this book of the Torah, but first we start with our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah hafok ba la'asok b'divrei Torah yadadai Welcome, Sandy. Good to see you. And to everyone who's joining us, whether on Facebook or YouTube or right here on Zoom, it's so good to be able to study Torah with all of you. So we are going to be studying this week Parashat Shlach, which means go on your way, about the 12 spies that are sent into Israel. And we're going to be focusing on the midah, the soul trait of Savlanut, of patience, and how that interplays with this week's portion. So let's begin. Let's see, I'll make this a little bigger. Is that good? Can everyone see this okay? Yes, awesome. Okay, so let's begin with the section from the Musar Torah commentary. Rabbi Sonia Pills wrote this portion. Would anyone like to read right from Savlanut? Oh, Dana, are you talking? You're muted right now.
No, I was sounding it out.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I'll read it if no one else.
Thank you, Jessica. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Dana. I apologize.
Savlanut means patience, we read in the dictionary. Savlanut means love, I often think. Without Savlanut, love dies. In fact, the very root of the word samech bet lamed bears a number of meanings. Our entire Tanakh and all its midrashic expansions may be seen an allegorical story of a people who are seeking and yearning to find their way into an intimate relationship with God, hoping, dreaming, imagining, and believing that God does the same, that God is waiting for us to find our way to love, patience, justice, intimacy, and trust. The main threat to this biblical love story seems to be a lack of patience, often from God's side, and sometimes from the side of the people.
Thank you, Jessica, so much. And we're going to get to the other root meanings of Savlanut in just a second. So that's hanging out there. We're going to pause on that piece. But what do you think about this relationship between Savlanut and love? What do you make of that?
Well, I know from the parent point of view, I think I was patient when I was patient with my children, only because I love them so much. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. I think that's an important relationship. If you love someone, you'll find in you the capacity of patience.
So because of relationship, you're able to kind of find that. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Anyone else have anything to add here? Yeah, go ahead, Dana.
Well, just upon reflection right now, I think patience requires a lot of thought and analysis of the situation. And so, it takes a lot of energy, and it's just not a feeling or an emotion that just comes up. It's a cognitive effort to be patient.
Absolutely. And we're going to get to that in a number of different ways as we go to the portion, that it's not just, holding back in that moment. There's so much more that's involved. It sounds easy, but it's really complicated.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah, of course.
I think why it was so hard for me at times is because it requires putting oneself aside, one's own desires and wants and feelings about how things should happen and go. You have to put them aside when you're being patient with another person or people. You really have to suspend yourself, your ego. And that's a very hard thing to do, for me at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually in Alan Marinis's book, Everyday Holiness, he has a whole section in this chapter about Savlanut. I didn't put it into this text study, although I thought about it. But he had a whole section about exactly what you just said, Jessica, about how sometimes when we're not patient, it's because we're so focused on ourselves that we're losing the relationship, the connection, and that it's only really through that we're able to harness our ability to have Savlanut. So thank you for bringing that in. I can only see a few people at a time, so I just want to make sure I'm not missing anyone. Feel free to unmute and jump in if you have something you'd like to add. I see a few of our friends have joined us. So good to see all of you and for you to be here.
Putting up that little hand, raising your hand is a really helpful thing. You can see that, right, Rabbi?
Yes, I can see when I only see 4 screens at a time, but if someone does the raise hand button, that goes up to the top. So I can always see that, and that's helpful.
That's in the reactions on my system at the bottom, but that's very helpful.
So whether you do that or you unmute and chime in, please don't hesitate to do either one of those two things. Let's look at one more text. So I said that we were going to talk about the other root meanings of Savlanut, that Hebrew word. And we know the way the Hebrew language works is very often there are root letters. And when you have those letters, you can make a number of different words to them, like with them. And very often those words have a relationship with one another. So it's a common practice to take words that share the same root and to compare them to one another and to glean some meaning from their interaction with one another. So we're going to be doing a little bit of that here. Rabbi Shlomo Wolbe said, "What is patience? A patient person is exactly like someone who is carrying a heavy package. Even though it weighs upon him, he continues to go upon his way and doesn't take a break from carrying it. The same is true in all relationships that are between people. We see and hear many things that are not according to our will, and still we continue to be friends." So what do you make of this metaphor? Well, why don't I first add the piece about the root words that comes up in what Alan Marinis said, and then we'll be able to talk through that a little more. So Alan Marinis says, the Hebrew term from patience is savlanut. It shares a linguistic root with sevel, which means suffering, and sabal, which means a porter. What could these 3 words possibly share in common? The answer is that being patient, it should say, means bearing the burden of your suffering. You tell yourself that I can bear these feelings on my inner shoulders, holding them aloft and not crumbling under their weight. Dana, please.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense, because just because a person shows patience doesn't mean they don't feel impatient inside. And the other thing, I don't know, I had skimmed this before. I don't know if you read it about Moses being impatient or whatever. Anyway, or God being impatient at some point. It's a very human thing. It's like a human trait to be impatient. So that's it's like hunger. it's there. So again, we have to use our cognition to think about, to stop ourselves, but it's always there. So I like this sentence.
Great. Thank you so much, Dana. And Jessica, and then Sandy.
Well, briefly, this brings up the issue of being patient with oneself. It seems like, bearing your own suffering and being patient with yourself, which is very important too.
Right. And sometimes if we're impatient with ourselves, that impatience can spread toward other people too, right? It's the skill that we have to work on. So that's so important. Yes, Sandy, please.
Well, I think that patience also indicates a silent optimism that things will improve through patience, that things will get better, that there's a rainbow at the end, and that's why it's important to be patient.
That's so wise here, right? Because why would you bear this burden if you believe you will never be able to ever put it down, right? But if you believe you're bearing it because it's going to bring something positive into fruition, maybe it's worth bearing it. So that's awesome. Anyone else want to chime in with anything here?
I have a comment, but I have some background noise. My landscaper showed up a day early, so I'll mute as soon as it gets loud. But we'll give you a practical example of that. Catherine and I just came from a doctor's office, and we waited longer than we thought we should, and it was uncomfortable waiting. And Catherine was chilly. She's always cold. And then, we just said, well, what are the alternatives? I mean, we can get up and leave, but Sandy said, this what you're here for, and you don't have many other options. And to change it would be more painful. So you grin and bear it.
Yeah, so it's patient about perhaps some of the things that we don't have control over anyway. Right, getting upset. It's like what I always say to my daughter when she's like waiting in line for something she doesn't want to wait in line for, right? It's like, well, being upset isn't going to change how long the line is. It's just going to make you miserable while you're standing here, right? So being able to let that go certainly makes it a little bit easier, doesn't it? So I know we had a comment in the chat about this week's Torah portion and how it factors into things, and that is exactly where we're going right now. So we're looking at the book of Numbers, and I'm going to bring in a couple of texts. These were also, I don't know if they were in their entirety, they didn't show up within the text, but they certainly were alluded and spoken about. So pretty early on in the portion, it says, when Moses sent them to scout the land, and it's talking about the 12 spies, one from each of the 12 tribes, right? To scout the land of Canaan, he said to them, go up there into the Negev and on into hill country and see what kind of a country it is. Are the people who dwell in it strong or weak, few or many? Is the country in which they dwell good or bad? Are the towns they live in open or fortified? Is the soil rich or poor? Is it wooded or not? And take pains to bring back some of the fruit of the land. Now, it happened to be the season of the first ripe grapes. So just kind of setting the tone of what's going on there. Then a few verses later, we get to this text. And this is very quickly, it goes to them returning and talking about the land. It says, this is what they told them. We came to the land you sent us to. It does indeed flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who inhabit the country are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the Anakites there. The Amalekites dwell in the Negev region. Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites inhabit the hill country. The Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. Caleb hushed the people before Moses and said, let us by all means go up. We shall gain possession of it, for we shall surely overcome it. But the other men who had gone up with him said, we cannot attack that people, for it is stronger than we. Thus they spread calumnies among the Israelites about the land that they had scouted, saying, the country that we traversed and scouted is one that devours its settlers. All the people that we saw in it are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The Nephilim are kind of like giants. The Anakites are a part of the Nephilim, and we look like grasshoppers to ourselves. And so we must have looked to them. So if we look at this text, we see a discrepancy among the reports of the spies who come back. 10 of the spies say, this land, we will never be able to overcome it. It is too much for us. We should just turn around right now. This is just too big of an ask. We are too scared to go into this land. And then we have Caleb and also Joshua, who will say the opposite, who will say, no, absolutely, God is telling us to go into this land. Let's go into this land. And Rabbi Sonia Pills, as we know from the portion that we read, talks about this through the lens of relationship. So does anyone want to read this section that she wrote?
I'll read it.
Thank you so much, Michael.
If you can hear me.
Yeah, we hear you. You're
Okay.
good.
In our Torah portion, God expects the people to be both brave and trusting. And when they are not, God reacts with angry disappointment. God punishes the spies and the people for being anxious and hesitant. However, Musar defines Savlanut not only as a character trait, but as a practice of endurance over time. Like love, patience can only become manifest in time. What good would it be if we were patient or loving for exactly a second? Musar teaches patience. Patience both with ourselves and with others. The patience it takes to forgive ourselves our own anxieties and paralyzing doubts, and the terrible consequences that might unfold in our lives. The patience it takes to postpone and adjust our visions. The patience it takes to perceive ourselves and others clearly. The patience it takes to assess and accept reality, including our fears and the time we need to become more faithful and trusting.
Michael, let's stop right there. Thank you so much for reading that. So as we look at this text, Rabbi Sonia is seeing this through this lens of impatience. And what do you make of that? When you read the text about the tribes, do you agree that the struggle within the text is about impatience on God's part?
Well, to me, I don't know, unless I wasn't listening carefully or reading, but some of the people are saying, yeah, the land is with milk and honey. It's great. And you can grow things and there's food and whatever. And then the other people are saying, yeah, but there are giants there who can really whip us. And then, is it Moses or whatever, or God is saying, yeah, but we could go there and just overpower them, even though we are like grasshoppers compared to them. So it's not one-sided. One is practical and one is seeing what the land can produce and what the possibilities are. But are those possibilities realistic with all the various different tribes and giants and whatever? Can they really be achieved? Can the land really, can they really overtake these giants?
Okay, so this is bringing up bigger questions, Michael, and what you're pointing to, your volume was getting a little bit low, so I'm not sure if everyone was able to hear you, but this question of what exactly is going on here, right? We're given conflicting reports. How are the Israelites supposed to know what to make of that? Right? And what the rabbis are saying is that 10 of the scouts who go in are allowing their anxieties to get the better of them. They're scared. And so sometimes when you're scared, I have a child who is very, very afraid of bees, right? And so in her mind, a bee is this like enormous animal that takes up all this space, right? Because when we have a fear, that fear makes the situation worse in our minds, right? So 10 of the scouts are completely kind of overtaken by fear, but 2 of the scouts are very much not. Dana, yeah, do you want to say more about your comment?
Well, I mean, it doesn't matter that the people have a reason to be impatient because they're scared of the reality. It seems like the portion is a test, to believe in God. I mean, have a faith in God's direction at this point. Even though, I mean, it's not, Moses is saying what God wants to do, correct? So Moses, or is it God? It's God's direction. So I think that's important.
Right. And from God's perspective, that's exactly it, right? I've taken you through the desert all this time. I've given you the Torah. Every time you have a need, your needs are met. I'm telling you, go into the promised land. What do you mean you're not ready to do that? What do you mean you don't think you'll be able to overcome it? I'm telling you to go, right? So from God's perspective, this frustration is understandable. But that doesn't mean that those 10 scouts are actually ready to go into the land of Israel. They're clearly too overtaken by fear. They just can't do it. And so a big part of this portion, a big part of what Rabbi Sonia is going into is that you can't really have Savlanut without having an accurate assessment of the situation. If you look at someone who, let's say there's a 5-year-old child and you give that 5-year-old child the book Harry Potter, but they haven't actually learned to read Cat in the Hat yet, you might get very frustrated sitting there ready for them to read Harry Potter, right? It's not going to happen. And you'll just get more and more frustrated. Why can't you read this book already, right? But this 5-year-old isn't able to do it yet. So there has to be an assessment of who is actually, where people are before we can figure out how Savlanut plays into it. So let's go ahead and read a little bit more of this portion. Let's see, what were we up to? I don't know if it moved around a little bit. Sorry about that.
Rabbi, could I just ask a question?
Please go ahead as I figure this out.
Why do you think it is that it was 10-2? Why 10 people's view corroborated? They all had the same reaction and they all saw the same things versus 2 who didn't. Wouldn't a leader say, well, sorry, these guys, there's 10 of them, and I would trust them. What is it that the Torah is trying to say, that the 2 outweighed the 10?
Well, the 2 didn't outweigh the 10. So from the perspective of the Torah, the 2 were actually correct, but the people didn't go into the land of Israel because they weren't ready. And that was demonstrated by the remarks of the 10, which got people Israel all riled up. But I mean, anyone have any other thoughts on this? Because Jessica asked really good questions here.
Well, wait, they did go, did they?
They did eventually. But they had to wander around for a lot longer. God realized that they would not be able to really go into the land of Israel at this time.
Okay.
Okay, we were down here. This is what it was. How God loved more, had God been patient, maybe then God would fully forgive the fearful Israelites. Maybe then God would understand that the divine desire to conquer the land now and to begin a new era of Torah's laws now cannot be fulfilled by this assemblage of anxious former slaves, and that fulfilling God's vision might not even be their wish. maybe God would learn that building trust takes time, and so does learning to love. Maybe then God would seize God's pain and disappointment with patience and would begin the slow and loving task of teaching a people how to trust. So essentially,
Wow.
what Rabbi Sonia is saying is that God is so excited about the people going into the land of Israel that God tells them to go, as opposed to really taking the time to see where they were and if they were emotionally ready to go into the land. And that was the impatience. And so I'm kind of curious, what do you make of that? Do you agree with that assessment, or is there something else that makes more sense to you?
It seems to me that God's emotionality was excitement was more like humans that don't think clearly enough about certain situations, and I find it kind of striking that God would God would be like that, rather than being the all-inspiring, all-knowing, omnipotent being that we choose to believe that God is.
Yeah, and there's a lot of places in the Torah, right, where God is very human. And
Yes.
this assessment is yet another one of those. And that doesn't mean that's the God to which we all relate. But you're right, it is striking how human God, how imperfect God is here. Yeah. Larry, Tammy, one of you still want to say something?
I was about to say the same thing, but I was muted. God shows so many human characteristics here. He's learning. He doesn't understand the people. God is very, very human here. And that's very surprising to see God portrayed that way. God is learning. Wow. I like it. I like it a lot. But it's sometimes difficult to God, who's all powerful, all knowing. How does God see God so human is very, very interesting. I think it's great.
Yeah, I mean, it also could beg the question in us, right? If God could be impatient in this really important way, then how much more could that happen to all of us?
Right.
And it kind of gives us the freedom to really think that through. Like, where are we allowing ourselves to kind of give into that? Where are we not making an accurate assessment of the abilities in the place where other people are? Where are we wishing that people who were other than who they actually are? Because if we have a better assessment, right? If we're at the doctor's office and we're in line and we believe we should be called right now and we're holding on to that, even though we know we have a 1 hour wait, we're going to make ourselves miserable. If we accept the assessment that we need to wait an hour, we might not have such a problem with Savlanut, like those kind of things.
It's also very interesting that the people are frightened to go. They don't have the patience to go. It's interesting that God even thought they were ready to go. All kinds of issues are being raised. Obviously, they weren't ready. They weren't ready for it. It takes a long time to forget slavery. 400 years of slavery, 2 years of wandering. They're not ready. The other part is, if they had crossed, Moses would have gone into the promised land. That's interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. Jessica, what would you like to say?
Well, the little bit of the Quran that I have read often says, thus says Allah, the all-powerful, the all-knowing, the all-merciful, yada, yada, yada. I can't remember reading such a description of God in the Torah like that. Is there such a thing?
No, there isn't.
So where does the feeling that the God is all powerful, all knowing, and God forbid we should insult God, or, where does that come from?
That's a really good question. There are so many different ideas of God within the Jewish tradition. And some of them are a God of perfection, right? An all-knowing everything. But there's problems with that. Questions of theodicy certainly challenge that considerably, because if God is all-knowing and all-powerful and all of that, then why would there be anything bad in the world, right? So a lot of texts, if we go through the Torah, there are many, many, many places in which God makes mistakes. If we remember during the High Holy Days, there's actually a prayer that we offer asking for God's forgiveness that is essentially a prayer that God teaches to Moses, so that when God becomes too impatient or becomes too angry, it is a reminder to God that God needs to try harder in order to be kind and compassionate, which gives an idea that, yeah, God is flawed. So there's different conceptions. I would never, ever tell anyone who the God that they should believe is. There's many different ideas in the Torah, but several of them, just strictly from the Torah texts, definitely demonstrate an imperfect God.
Right. That's scary.
So let's get to the crux of these two questions. We know that with Musar, every characteristic has extremes. And when we go to the extremes of those characteristics, we run into problems. We become out of balance, right?
Mhm.
And so with Savlanut, what happens when we have not enough of it? And what happens when we have too much?
We freeze. We don't know what to do. We become frightened. We don't trust enough. So we use
So if we don't have enough, we don't trust enough, and we become frightened. Is that what you're saying?
yes. So we use our impatience to postpone things.
Anyone else? Reasons, what would happen if we don't have enough Savlanut?
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yeah.
So as you said, there are a number of instances in the Torah that it's pointed out that God is imperfect. So I'm asking myself, what ideal can we aspire to in our own lives if we're acknowledging that God, him or herself, is not a perfect thing to incorporate in our lives as again, I'll use the word ideal. I don't it's bad enough that people choose to be imperfect, but in their treatment of others and so on. But what about God? Who do we aspire to be like?
So I think it's a really good question that you're asking, Michael, about how do we make sense of an imperfect God, right?
Yes.
And part of it, I think, actually is based on kind of a falsehood that we're aiming for perfection. Maybe we're not aiming for perfection. Maybe we're aiming to consistently better ourselves. We're all imperfect. If we strive for perfection, we will fail, right? We're not capable of being perfect beings. We were created as imperfect beings, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes through our imperfections, we actually are able to gain incredible learning and sensitivity, which enables us to be better versions of ourselves. So it could be that the greatest learning isn't necessarily in how to become perfect, because that's unattainable, but rather how we can live as imperfect beings that continue to improve ourselves, continue to make this world better, and continue to inspire one another. And by demonstrating this of God's learning over time, of God asking to be reminded of who God is at God's core, that can actually inspire us to do the same.
Thank you.
It's super, super complicated. There's so much to discuss there.
I mean, really.
I do plan in the fall, by the way, to be offering a class that is entirely focused around faith and about different ideas of God, where we'll explore more of this and more of so many other notions of God as well. So there'll be more information about that coming out in the next couple of months. Yeah, Tom, please.
Yeah. So I was going to say, well, Michael, that's a big question, right? What you were asking. Yeah. But as your question about, what happens if we're lacking in patience, and what tends to happen, and obviously, if we're not, patience is accepting the reality of your situation on a certain level. So if you're not patient, you're not accepting that, and that gives into frustration, anger. You're not accepting. This is not okay. This is not. You're not accepting what is, and I think that's it leads us to. If we don't have the power to change it ourselves, it leads us to frustration and disappointment and anger.
Quickly, I don't know why God's impatient or why he's imperfect.
That is such a good, thoughtful statement, Ezra, right? Like, we see this, Rabbi Sonia saying, here's an instance of impatience. If only God had waited a little bit more, perhaps it would have been successful, right? But you're saying, why would God be impatient here? Like, why would that even happen? And it's a really good question. Does anyone have any ideas?
Well, all the classical gods of Greece and Rome were awfully impatient and violent and cruel. We were the next step, so maybe it was logical to have some human attributes, not bad ones entirely, to flesh out, as it were, our God.
Yeah, just this evolution of faith, you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
Tom.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jessica. Continue if there's something you wanted to
Just
say.
brief. This is the first monotheistic God.
Yes.
So, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Oh, hey, Irv.
Hey.
What I was going to say, it gets into, the question of God, theism, pantheism, panentheism, what is God? What is the nature of God? And, there's this whole, body of thinking that, is God another entity, is part of the universe, or is it a separate entity? God created these things, but is when God created these things, is there more or less of reality? In other words, is God separate than that, or is God part of creation? Is God, so these are, these different, kind of philosophical looks at what that is. And I think that kind of drills down to the heart of that issue. Traditionally, deism, people were thinking of a guy on a cloud with a white beard and, sitting on a throne, and, kind of a separate entity, right? That is a separate being. And so, a lot of the mystics, in Judaism and other faiths also there's more of a look at God is creator of all things and part of all things, and we're part of creation. And so there's more of a unity ultimately that we're to be striving for. So it depends on where those big questions and those big answers. And I've been trying to, think about that stuff too. And that's why I've been reading the Buber stuff and, all of that. And in his view, we encounter the divine through us as manifestations of the divine. And so those connections, those, that community, those interpersonal connections, that's all part of that encounter with the divine. And, we're to strive to, as the rabbi was saying, maybe there's, we're not, held to be perfect, but to be striving towards something. So I don't know, but I can't wait for that new class or whatever it is. That sounds great.
Yeah, great comments. Thanks so much, Tom, for bringing all of that in. Yeah, Dana, what would you like to say?
Well, I was just thinking about the fact that we all expect God to be patient. It's not God's job to be patient. It's God's job to tell us how to be good. And, until the people decide to take good actions, nothing's going to move forward. It seems like that's the story in the Torah. Some people learn, some people don't. It doesn't matter how patient God would be if the people don't take it on within themselves to learn to be patient and move forward. It's not going to work. The people have to take action, whether it's 2 or 12. In the end, until are they a people Israel now? Are they a community right now? Yeah, so they're still learning, but in a way, it's not God's job. God told them what to do. They have to take the action. So that's what's and also, from my community, because we're Reconstructionists, rabbis always talk about the spark of the divine when they're doing things within people. And that indeed, it's like what was just said, you find it within community. And this would be an example of that. So that's what I was thinking.
Thank you so much, Dana, because that brings us to the second question too, right? What happens when we have too much Savlanut? Right? That also can be a problem. If we are endlessly patient, what kind of problem can come from that?
Stagnation and nothing gets done. I mean, if you have any kind of mission, you have. I like to bring it down to a practical point of view. It's as individuals, we don't, we behave the way we've developed our characters, through life, however we got it, parented, whatever, and we act automatically. We are the person we are. But when there are other people involved, maybe just a spouse, maybe there's children, then there's the community, and there's a temple over here, and then there's a community organization over here, and then each one of those things require some sort of patience to deal with. But in my opinion, the groups, when you get past the personal and you get into the groups, it's the leadership. It's the people who guide the masses. I think of the movie 12 Angry Men, when there was a court case, if you remember, a court case, and the jury was 11-1 on what was the author had, an innocent man, 11-1 to convict. One by one, single juror talked to, cajoled, reasoned with, found reason, and led the jury to the right conclusion. So in my opinion, depending on if we have a big issue at the temple, it's going to take leadership to keep the thing from busting apart. So it's a voluntary kind of an association. We're not scripted into this thing. So I think the authors here are talking about a period of time where people had to be convinced to do what was right. And it took leadership, and sometimes leadership takes time, but you can't sit back and wait forever, because then you'll never get the job done.
Thank you so much, Herb. So, what it sounds like to me is when we don't have Savlanut, when we don't have enough of it, we stop seeing each other as whole people. right? I think that's what you were talking about, or that's what you were talking about. Actually, several of you, I think we're getting to that and talking about Boober and everything else, right? Tom, what you were saying. We stop really seeing one another. And I think if we were to look at the political kind of landscape in America right now, I think a lot of us have lost patience with one another, Republican, Democrat, all different sorts of things. And when that happens and we stop really seeing one another, when we stop really being able to come to the same conception of reality, then it makes it really, really hard to move forward and to build these loving relationships. When we have too much patience, we stop holding one another accountable. We get nothing done, and we're just also in a state of frustration. So about finding this balance between the two so that everyone can be seen, but also really pushed to do their best. Yeah, Jessica.
I hear you saying that patience is contextual. And in the context, for example, of teaching, I think that it takes tremendous amount of patience, way past what an average observer might say. Hey, wait a minute, you've already said that, you've already explained it, you've already, enough already, go on. But I don't think that's how teaching can be, especially in the younger grades, can be approached. That it has to be, you have to stay with the child and repeat and help the child until the child understands. And that takes maybe way more patience than in other contexts, like standing in line, for example. You know, that's a different kind of patience.
Yeah, it takes a special person to be an educator because of that, right? Yeah, Michael, please.
I just wanted to, I happened to write down a note or two that I believe you said either in your sermon or along the way on the 27th of May, something to the extent that our thoughts and prayers require action. And in this case, too much patience in something would lead to inaction. So, and then I wrote that we change things, and to make holiness we changed. I can't even read my own writing. In order to bring this action into our life, we have to make holiness manifest our lives. It requires action rather than just prayer alone. I don't mean to misquote you, but I hope what I said was getting the idea of what I thought you said during, I believe, maybe your sermon.
Yeah, that was right around the school shooting.
Okay.
And how very often everyone is saying thoughts and prayers, thoughts and prayers, thoughts and prayers. And yet the same thing keeps happening and the problems aren't getting solved and there's more and more gun violence, right? And that is a really good example of this with Savlanut, that we can be so patient. Yeah, they'll figure it out eventually. Meanwhile, innocent children are being killed and innocent teachers are being killed. And so many people's lives have been changed in such a negative way, right? Patience, too much patience isn't good. There are times where it is important to say enough already.
Right.
Exactly.
That's what I wanted to add, what Michael said and what you just said.
Yeah.
Too much patience becomes an excuse to not do anything. And we've seen that so many times.
Yeah.
We've seen it growing up with our parents in some cases, that they were too much patience. We wanted more from them. The same thing in society. We want more from society. Don't have to wait another 20 years. Imagine if people said that about slavery. Just patience. So patience becomes an excuse, can be an excuse to let things slide and not take responsibility and not engage. It's an excuse to sit at home and not engage.
Mm.
Yeah, and that's exactly why Musar is all based on being self-aware so that we actually gain the skills to see in ourselves when we're using a trait in order to disengage, in order to put the responsibility elsewhere, or when we're engaging with the trait in a way that is actually really healthy. But it's only through our self-awareness, it's only through our awareness of the world and our willingness to really grapple with the messiness of life that we can come to that conclusion.
Right. Yes.
And indeed, I included 2 texts here that talk to exactly that, right? There's circumstances in which we shouldn't be patient and patience isn't helpful. I'm not reading that whole text because we really did talk to a lot of that already. And that patience doesn't mean that we become passive. We still need to make a genuine effort to set the pace and trajectory of our lives, but we don't need to react to every delay or deflection as if it were a denial, rather than means a denial of ourselves or a denial by God. In those moments when I am good at being patient, I live in the here and now without straining against reality. I walk a middle path, not leaning to the one extreme of being inactive and fatalistic, because that way I negate the powers I do have, limited though they might be, nor veering to the other where impatience reigns. So really trying to find this happy medium in ourselves. There's a couple more texts. I'm just looking at the time and I need to leave in a little bit because my daughter gets out of her acting camp at 2. But Benjamin Ehrenfeld wrote, "Last week I had the privilege of experiencing a removal of all 4 wisdom teeth and 1 extra tooth that had grown behind one of my top front teeth." I know, we feel that pain for them, right? The entire experience has been a test of patience. Upon arriving home, the first day was filled with moments in which I attempted to act as if I was one step ahead of the recovery process at all times. I was impatient. It is completely understandable to be impatient when you're recovering from a surgical procedure. Our bodies are not used to having things taken out of them or having new things put into them. Nevertheless, acting out of impatience when a body is trying to recover can actually increase the time necessary for recovery. In other words, it is counterproductive. Once I began to behave patiently with my body, my recovery process began to accelerate dramatically. It's still a little uncomfortable. I'm looking forward to apples, crunchy raw vegetables, chips, and salsa again. It's my prayer that learning to be patient with my body was a mini training to improve my ability to be patient with others. There's very little that can be accomplished trying to force any living thing to move before it's ready. Often you'll spend longer in the argument about the forcing than you would have if you were just a little more patient. May this be a season in which we can all get a little better at being patient about those things over which we have no control. And I think that spoke to some of our comments earlier. Yeah, Larry, is there something you wanted to say?
No, I forgot to take my hand down.
Oh, okay.
What he didn't say is that had he possibly followed the dentist or oral surgeon's advice of using ice and anti-inflammatory agents, he would have healed faster. Patience or not patience.
Right. So some of it is medical, right? We need people who know their fields to teach us that. But I mean, the lesson around patience here, I think we've all been in situations where our impatience with our own healing and trying to act as if we're healthier than we actually are has actually set us 2 steps behind instead of helping. So it's a really good example, I think.
True.
So in a way, that's like the Israelites. Some of the people listened to God and some didn't. And that would be an example. Why?
Yeah.
All right.
It's in different places.
Absolutely. And that self-awareness can help us to figure out exactly where we are, even if it's not where we want to be. Okay, we're getting toward the very end, but I also wanted to share this one text with you that I really love from Avot de Rabbi Natan. It's a midrash. said, how did Rabbi Akiva start out? Now, Rabbi Akiva is one of the most incredible wise rabbis of all time, but he didn't start studying Torah. He didn't start studying Hebrew until he was 40 years old. Okay, so this is a text about him. How did Rabbi Akiva start out? They said he was 40 years old and he had never studied anything. Once he stood at a wall. He said, "Who engraved this stone?" They told him, "It was the water which drips upon it every day." And they said to him, "Akiva, are you not familiar with the verse, 'As the waters wear away the stones'?" On the spot, Rabbi Akiva made the following deduction. If something soft, like water, could chisel its way through something hard like stone, then surely the words of Torah, which are as hard as iron, can penetrate my heart, which is flesh and blood. Immediately, he returned to studying Torah. So just this idea that sometimes it is through a very slow process that the biggest impact in our lives can be made. It's not always in one big moment, right? It could just happen slowly with patience over time. And two last little things to bring in. This is Solomon Ibn Gabriel, 11th century poet and philosopher, and he made many really powerful statements. These are just two of them. He said, misfortune may become fortune through patience, and then nothing reduces misfortune like patience. So anyone have any idea what he's trying to get out through that?
Maybe it means,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, maybe it means if you wait long enough, everyone will forget about it.
I was going to say that.
That's a little cynical.
Time heals all wounds.
Any other ideas here? Yeah, I mean, so it could be that, right? It could be time heals wounds, that we need time to be able to work it through.
And you may see things differently.
Yeah. And that takes some humility, doesn't it?
Yeah. And patience.
I read the gist of a story of somebody who was very impatient because they missed the plane. They didn't get there in time. And later on, it's not because of patience, it's more just because of the way fortune turns out. The plane crashes and everybody dies. And now the person, it isn't that they were patient, they were upset by missing the plane, but circumstances turn out differently. And I'm not sure how that relates, but it just seemed to come to mind.
Yeah, well, we never know, right? But if I can't speak exactly to the plane thing because I think that can take us down a different avenue that's a little bit different than this. But this idea that when we insert patience, when we give an opportunity to really see each other, as we might not if we're impatient, if we ascertain the situation rather than trying to get ahead of ourselves, then maybe we can bring down our suffering and we can actually, feel more at peace and in a better spot. Yeah, Tom.
No, I was just, thinking that, patience, when is that really an issue? When does that come up? And it's really because circumstances in our lives are constantly changing. So patience is kind of geared towards as to a certain situation or circumstances. And as we all know in life, these things change continually. And, part of it is your perspective and part of it is things are constantly changing. So as to the poet, as to those ideas.
Absolutely. I want to thank you all so much for this really insightful conversation. I always learn so much from all of you. And I hope that all of us can find in this coming week patience in the most productive and helpful ways. And I look forward to continuing next week with you in our next Torah portion. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.